Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to our embryology webinar series under the microscope. I'm going to wait for some people to trickle in and let me know that they can hear me. Make sure everything's going okay. All right, I hope you had a nice Valentine's Day yesterday. We had a lot of treats here in the office, cookies, candies, chocolate. All right. Thank you, Liz. Okay, so I'm Maureen. I'm one of the embryologists in the Syracuse Embryology Lab at CNY Fertility. And I'm doing these videos to give you guys a little bit of insight into what happens in the embryology lab. I know it's kind of mysterious. You guys don't get to see a lot of what we do behind the scenes here. Today I thought I would talk a little bit about ICSI, the ICSI procedure, and I'm going to show you a little video clip of ICSI. I think it's really cool, and a lot of people, when they visit the lab and they see ICSI, it's one of their favorite things. So that's what I'm going to show you today, and then I will just take your questions. Usually it just turns into a question and answer, which is great. Hi. Okay. So here at CNY Fertility, we use ICSI for 99% of our IVF cases when we're in the lab. So ICSI is when we inject the sperm right into the egg. And the alternative to ICSI is what's called conventional IVF, and that's when we take a sperm sample and we put it in a petri dish with the eggs and we see what happens. So we hope that the sperm swims around and gets into the eggs. We do ICSI here because then we can ensure that each mature egg is injected with one sperm. So it gives us a little bit more control over the fertilization process. Also, when we do ICSI, we're able to see how many of your eggs are mature, which gives us a little bit extra data, gives your doctor a little more data on how many mature eggs you retrieve on the day of retrieval. Sometimes eggs will mature overnight, and if we do conventional insemination, we wouldn't really know what day your eggs were mature. Let's see, sometimes a barrier to fertilization is that the sperm is unable to get into the egg. There's so many biochemical reactions that have to take place in order for the sperm to bind to the egg and then to actually get inside of it. So by doing ICSI, we are directly placing the sperm right in the egg, we're activating the egg, activating the sperm, and we're ready to go. Let me see. Oh yes, and when we ICSI, we are selecting the best quality sperm. Oh, my video cut out for a second. Can you still see me? Okay, sorry about that, my screen froze. Okay, so when we're doing ICSI, we're under very high magnification and your embryologist can pick the best looking sperm. So we're looking for the proper shape. We're looking at the head of the sperm, making sure it's not too narrow, too wide, doesn't have vacuoles, and we're looking for the sperm to be swimming fast and straight. So not all kinds, sometimes they're like off to the side or they're going in circles. So we're picking the sperm that have good forward progression and as normal shape as we can find. Okay, so I have a video to show you. I'm on a tablet, so I can't share my screen. So I'm going to hold up the tablet to the computer. So bear with me for just a second. This is the best that I could figure out. All right, facing back. Okay. So this video is a YouTube video from Fertility Associates. And here is the needle, and he just selected his sperm. So there's one sperm here. They're slashing the tail, and they're picking up the sperm into their injection needle. And then they're going to go and find their egg that they want to inject. Now, this outer shell is the zona pellucida. That's the outside of the egg, the shell that's protecting all the good stuff on the inside. And he's trying to get it situated properly. That's the hardest part, is moving the eggs around and getting them facing where we want to go. It takes a lot of practice. This is our holding pipette. So this is going to have a little bit of suction and hold onto the egg. You can see down here, this is the polar body. So only mature eggs can be fertilized. And the way we tell if an egg is mature is by this polar body here. Okay, so they're bringing their sperm down to the needle. The sperm's right there. They're pushing and pushing. It takes a little bit to pop this ulema, the membrane. They're inside. They've sucked the sperm back, and now they're slowly expelling the sperm into the egg. And they're going to leave the sperm right there. And then they're going to do that for every egg. All right. I hope that was clear enough for you. Thought that was a pretty good video. All right, let me get you stuck here again. Okay, so then the next day after the ICSI procedure, we're under high magnification again, and we are looking for two pronuclei. So we're looking to see that the egg fertilized properly. And I showed you guys this picture before, but these two circles in the middle there, let's see, there and there, one from the egg, one from the sperm, and that's how we tell that the egg was fertilized properly. Okay. All right, so that's the ICSI procedure. The egg that you saw there is about the size of a grain of sand. It's as thick as a strand of hair. So it's very, very small. Everything we do is under very high magnification. The egg is the largest cell in the human body, and the sperm is one of the smallest cells in the human body. All right, so I can start taking some questions. All right, so shipping embryos from other clinics. We do get a lot of embryos from outside clinics. There's going to be a lot of paperwork ahead of time that needs to be done. We have a shipping coordinator here who can help you with that and make sure that your embryos are going to be a good match for our lab. We do have experience thawing eggs and embryos from a lot of different centers that use a lot of different techniques. So most of the time we are able to accommodate. But we will let you know if, however, your eggs and embryos will be frozen would be compatible with us to do the thaw. So Erica asked, does entering it with a needle cause stress to the egg? It's a very, very fine needle, and we are very careful when we are injecting it. There is a risk that you could damage the egg during the ICSI procedure, but we practice quite a bit. And if the egg degenerates after ICSI, it was likely very poor quality and wasn't going to continue to grow. So they're fragile, but they do mostly survive that procedure. It does look a little bit aggressive when you watch stabbing it with a needle, but they do just fine. So assisted hatching. So assisted hatching is when we use a laser and we make a small opening in that zona pellucida, which was that shell that was on the outside of the egg, which hangs on for quite a while. So as your embryo develops, this shell is going to thin out. And right before the embryo implants, it needs to come out of that shell. So in an ideal world, that shell will thin and thin and thin, and the embryo, as it expands, will break out of that shell. So what assisted hatching does is causes a little opening so that just in case one of your barriers to success is that the embryo is not hatching, That's why it's called assisted hatching. So we're giving it a little bit of space, giving it a little help to come out and attach to your uterine lining. So we do assisted hatching on pretty much all of our embryos here. It's especially recommended if you're over the age of 37. And we highly, highly recommend doing it on all of our frozen and thawed embryos because that zona, that shell, can harden a little bit in the cryopreservation process. The question was if it increases your chance of multiples. We haven't seen that. We do that for all of our cases. That hatching is going to take place hopefully naturally as well if we did not create the opening. And this question was about ICSI, so I'll answer that one. Do they ever put more than one sperm into the egg in ICSI? No. So the whole point of doing ICSI is that we are putting just one sperm into the egg. We want the correct number of chromosomes. If we put 2 sperm in there, it could create an abnormal embryo, or it may just not continue to develop. And yes, we do assisted hatching on our fresh transfers as well. Okay, so, and if your embryo was already hatching prior to transfer, occasionally your embryos will start to hatch by themselves in the lab. That's great. Then we wouldn't have a need to do assisted hatching. I think I have a picture of a hatching embryo. So this last one, the day 6 embryo, kind of looks like a blob is coming out. That's the embryo hatching out of the shell. Okay, so if an embryo was frozen, can you still do PGT? Yes, we can do Pgt testing with frozen embryos. There's a few things to consider. We want to make sure we're starting out with a relatively good quality embryo before we put it through that process. If it's a poor quality embryo, there's a risk that once we thaw it, it won't continue to grow or have enough cells for us to safely biopsy it and refreeze it. So it really mostly depends on your quality of your embryos if we would recommend attempting the Pgt testing. But we do it pretty often, and we do have success when we thaw and biopsy and get good results. So it is an option. There is an additional cost for the thaw, biopsy, culture, and refreeze. I'm seeing some questions about Zymot, a little bit about Pixie. We have started using Zymot in the last maybe 6 months. It hasn't been too long. We do like it. We don't have really pregnancy outcome data with Zymot yet because we haven't been using it that long, but we do see good fertilization. We see good fertilization without Zymot too. But if you know that you have DNA fragmentation in the sperm, it can help not cause further DNA fragmentation when processing the sperm with Zymot. So with Zymot, the sperm are swimming through this device. It's like, I guess you could almost think of it like a microchip in a way. So they're swimming through this little device, and at the end, the embryologists have just the sperm that made it through that device to work with. So it's just helping us select the best sperm, but when we do ICSI, we already are selecting the best sperm, like I talked about before. So, for years and years and years, we've used our regular sperm preparation technique, and it's been just fine. If you did want to add something, we would probably recommend Zymot over Pixie, if that answers your question. Some people, Vanessa asked a question why you wouldn't do ICSI. Some people have had success in the past at other clinics doing conventional IVF, so they just want to stick with their protocol that they've done before. I think maybe some sort of religious reasons that they want nature to select instead of the embryologist to select the sperm. I'm not really sure. That might make up the 1% of people that choose not to do ICSI. Okay, so this question is about how long it takes for Cooper to get the biopsy samples. So when we do Pgt testing with Cooper Genomics, they provide a courier service. So they will pick up these samples the same day that we do the biopsy or the next morning. We freeze the cells. So your embryo is frozen and never leaves CNY Fertility. So we're not sending your embryos to Cooper, we're sending the little biopsied cells that we took. So the samples are picked up by their courier and driven directly to their lab. So they are not shipped, they are couriered. So that's very nice. Lauren, there is some information on our website about ICSI and the risk of certain birth defects. I'm not well versed enough to discuss them here on this live, but if you look on our website, there's conflicting research. It's very minimal, and it may be due to the fact that ICSI is widely used for male factor infertility. So if you are already starting with male factor infertility, that could be theoretically passed down genetically to the offspring. But I would look at our website. There's some information there. Let's see. Some other questions about PGT testing. PGT testing is really going to depend on your specific case and, oops, sorry, I keep clicking. Your specific case and what your doctor thinks is going to be best for your cycle. I think it's fine to do PGT testing. It's fine not to do PGT testing. PGT testing is just another selection tool that's going to allow us to pick the embryo that I suppose would have the highest chance of creating a pregnancy, because we know that the chromosomes are normal. However, it's just another selection tool. So it's not going to change your embryos or make them better. We can't change with what we already have, but it's going to tell you which ones may be most successful if they're transferred. So if you had 10 embryos and 5 were normal, doing PGT testing, you would start with the normal ones and you would know they were normal. But like I said, it can't change your embryos. It's just another selection tool. I'm seeing a couple of questions about supplements. That's really out of my scope of expertise, but I know we have a ton of information on our website about all the different supplements that Dr. Kiltz recommends. Okay, what's better, day 5 3AA or day 6 4AA? These embryos are equivalent. I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. So a day 5 3AA, if it was left to grow overnight, would likely be a day 6 4AA. We typically start with the day 5 embryos because there's research out there showing that if it creates a blastocyst on day 5, it's a little bit more likely to be euploid or normal in terms of PGT testing, but I would say these embryos are equivalent. This is a tough question. So this patient has 2 euploid embryos and is wondering if they should go ahead with a transfer or try to get more embryos. In general, a euploid embryo has a 65% chance of success. In the IVF world, people say 2 to 3 embryos, 2 to 3 euploid embryos to get a take-home baby. But the first one could work or neither of them could work. It's such a tough call. I would probably have a consult with a doctor to discuss your case, your history, your uterus, and go from there. It's congratulations on your 2 euploid embryos, though. That's wonderful. I'm just trying to follow the questions here. Okay, do PGT results then disregard embryo grades? So I would say we don't totally disregard embryo grades, but if we have PGT results, those would trump the embryo grades. So if you had, you know, a euploid fair to poor embryo or an abnormal or aneuploid good graded embryo, we would still go with the euploid embryo. The chromosomes are more important than what the embryo looks like to us under the microscope. If you have two euploid embryos and one's an AA and one's a BB, we would go with the AA because it just has more cells. It's a little bit more likely to be successful. But we don't totally disregard the grades, but we would place more weight on the PGT results, if that makes sense. Is one better than the other, fresh versus frozen? I'm not sure if you're talking about eggs, embryos, or sperm. Let me know. How can we learn about embryo grading? That's a great question. I'm trying to think if there's any information about grading on our website. In general, it all boils down to good, fair, or poor quality. There's definitely details in there. So if you have a day 3 embryo, it's going to have 2 numbers. The first number is 1, 2, 3, or 4. So 1 being poor, 2 being fair, and 3 and 4 being good. And then your second number is going to tell you how many cells your day 3 embryo has. We're looking for more than 6 cells. So that would mean if you had a 3-8, that would be a good graded embryo with 8 cells, which is great for a day 3 embryo. If you had a 2-7, that would be a fair embryo with 7 cells. So we can always send you our grading template information. If you send Embryology a web message through your portal, we can send you our template. So that would be day 3 embryos. Blastocyst embryos are day 5, 6, and 7. And those are also going to be good, fair, or poor, but the numbers mean slightly different. So the good, fair, and poor comes from the A, B, or C when we're at the blastocyst stage. The first letter is the inner cell mass, which is the part of the embryo that develops into the baby. And then the second letter is the trophectoderm, which is what develops into the placenta and amniotic sac. So here's a blastocyst. This would be an AA. So the first letter is describing the inner cell mass, which is this ball of cells here. That looks really good, so it would be an A. And then the second letter is describing all these cells around the outside. So we're looking for the embryo to be very cellular, kind of uniform size cells on the outside there. So if you had an AB, that would be a good inner cell mass, fair trophectoderm. And then the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for our blastocyst is just how expanded the blastocyst is. So 1 and 2 are early, meaning they're a little bit smaller. That zona hasn't thinned out yet. 3 and 4 are expanded blastocysts, so the zona is starting to thin. A 5 is a hatching blastocyst, which is what I showed you before, the picture where the embryo is starting to come out of the shell. And then a 6 would be a fully hatched blastocyst, meaning it's totally out of the shell. Shell doesn't matter anymore, and you just have the cells that are your embryo. So that's a quick review on grading. Like I said, you can definitely message us if you have questions about your specific embryo grades. Okay, so this is a good question. Talking about transferring euploid embryos. If you've done Pgt testing on your embryos and you have normal or euploid embryos, first off, congratulations. Second off, we always recommend transferring one, just because your risk of multiples is higher when you are starting out with euploid embryos. You could transfer one normal embryo and end up with twins, or you could transfer 2 normal embryos and end up with quadruplets. So any pregnancy with multiples is high risk to mother and babies. So we follow ASRM guidelines, and they would recommend 1 embryo at a time when you have Pgt tested normal embryos. If in your specific case you have reasons why you think you need to transfer more than 1, you would have to talk to one of the doctors and go over that. If you've had a lot of implantation failure in the past or something like that, They may be open to letting you transfer more than one, but in general, we recommend one euploid embryo at a time. Thanks, Vanessa. I'm trying my best. Some of these I'm not sure what we're referring to here. All right, this is a good one. So this question is asking about doing a day 3 transfer or freeze versus day 5. So this is probably the question that we get asked the most in the lab and what we deal with on a day-to-day basis while we're doing your embryo checks. This is again going to be really specific to the individual. It's a case-by-case basis. It's going to be based on how many embryos you have, the quality of those embryos, and any previous cycles that you've done, how those cycles went for you. So we're looking at, have you made blastocysts in the past? So did you have a cycle where you had a lot of day 3 embryos and then they didn't make it to the blastocyst stage? We might decide to lean towards day 3 to make sure we get those embryos transferred into you and give them a chance. If you are somebody who may have had only a few embryos and they still made it to blast, whether with us or another clinic, then you've kind of proven to us that you make good blasts. So we might lean towards pushing to day 5. If we don't have any history, that's totally fine. We're looking at the quality of the embryos on day 3. Typically, if we have 4, 5, or more embryos on day 3, we prefer to push to blastocyst sometimes. It's a natural selection process, so there's going to be drop-off. People are surprised at that, but there's going to be drop-off from day 3 to day 5 most likely. So this is a natural selection that happens. Not all embryos, unfortunately, not all eggs are going to fertilize. Not all fertilized eggs are going to make great embryos. Not all embryos are going to make it from day 3 to day 5. But by holding out to the blastocyst stage, it's a selection tool that allows us to transfer the embryos that are the strongest or have proven that they can continue to grow a little bit more. So if you are, say, under the age of 37 maybe, and you have 8 embryos on day 3, we would like to push those. You may end up with 4 really good embryos and 4 embryo transfers. If we froze all your embryos on day 3 and we wanted you to transfer them one at a time, it might take you longer to get to that positive outcome. I hope that makes sense. A lot of our slightly older patients, if you are kind of over 38, they tend not to make quite as many embryos in the first place, and being that ASRM will allow them to transfer, more than one embryo at a time. So if you're, say you're 40 years old, you might be transferring 2 or 3 embryos at a time, then we'd be more comfortable freezing or transferring on day 3. So I hope that answered your question. It's very specific to the individual. And if you're planning to do Pgt testing, they have to be blastocyst embryos. So you have to push to day 5, 6, or 7. We can only biopsy the embryos that grow to the blastocyst stage and have enough cells to safely biopsy. All right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense, Holly. All right, a lot of these questions are more for the clinical team. I don't want to speak out of turn, so I apologize if I don't answer your question. Oops. Okay, let's see. I can answer this question. How many embryos are damaged during PGS? We're not damaging the embryos during PGS testing. We're only going to biopsy the embryos if there's plenty of cells to take from and that it's safe for us to do so. So biopsy is another technique that we practice on hundreds of embryos before we're working on patient embryos. So we wouldn't, if there was a case where you had some embryos that were poor quality that we weren't sure if we could safely biopsy, we would call you in that case and tell you, hey, we can try to biopsy this. We don't know if this embryo is quite good enough to biopsy, but we can attempt it. Or would you rather us just freeze it without biopsy? So we would always let you know if that was the case. That happens occasionally. Sometimes, you know, if your embryos aren't making blastocysts until day 7, we might give you, you know, call you and give you the option to freeze without biopsy. But we're not, you know, we're not going to biopsy any embryos that we would harm by doing so. Okay, so these are some great questions about patient updates from the embryology lab. So you're going to get a call from the nurse on day 1, and she's going to tell you how many of your eggs fertilized. So how many were mature and able to be injected and how many were fertilized. So you may have retrieved 12 eggs and maybe 10 were mature, and we injected those and 8 fertilized, for example. And then at that time on day 1, the nurse is going to confirm what your cycle plan is. So whether you're doing a fresh transfer, whether we're freezing the embryos, or whether you're doing Pgt testing and freezing the embryos. And the nurse is going to give the lab instructions based on that. Typically, you won't hear from the lab unless we need your input, like I said before about the Pgt testing. Occasionally, if you're right on the borderline on day 3 check and we are trying to decide whether to push your embryo to the blastocyst stage, occasionally we will call you if it really seemed like a really tough decision and we wanted your input. So you really won't hear from the lab until your embryos are either your transfer day or your embryos are frozen. So once the embryos are frozen, whether that's day 3 or the blastocyst stage, day 5 or 6, we're going to put a report into your portal, which tells you how many embryos were frozen and the grades of those embryos. And then if you had questions about those, feel free to message us back. If you're doing a fresh transfer, you get to talk to us the day of your transfer. We'll show you photos of the embryos and we'll go over how they're doing and pick out the best embryo to transfer with you and the doctor. And then at that point, we would tell you if we were going to freeze the rest of the embryos that day or hold them a little bit longer, depending on how they're developing. And so you have your fresh transfer, and then once any extra embryos are frozen, we would again put a report in your portal with the grades and how many embryos were frozen. If you're doing Pgt testing, you would get a message from Embryology again telling you, we would tell you how many were biopsied and frozen, and then you would get a call from us when we get those Pgt results from Cooper Genomics, and that takes 7 to 10 days. "23 eggs retrieved, 10 fertilized, and 2 made it to day 5. So Rebecca, yeah, that we do see this quite a bit. So we expect about half of the embryos to make it from day 3 to day 5. And again, that's just an average. So some people are going to fall above average and some are going to be below. I think what I would say is that you did make blastocysts, and now we know which 2 embryos were the best ones for you to transfer. So being that you had 10 on day 3, I would recommend pushing to blast. If you ended up doing another cycle and there were some less embryos, maybe I would suggest freezing on day 3 if you were transferring more than one at a time, but I'm not sure how old you are, so that also goes into play. All right, I'm wrapping up here. If you're doing PGT, yes, you get embryo photos too. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. So when we send you your update at the end of the cycle with how many embryos were frozen and the grades of the embryos, we do also upload the pictures. Now, it's not just the pictures of the embryos were frozen, it's all the embryos throughout the cycle. So, you know, if you had 5 embryos on day 5 and we froze 2, you would get a picture with all 5 embryos, but that's just because we take the pictures as we do the FERT checks. We don't then sort them and take pictures. So you're going to get pictures from day 3, day 5, day 6, day 7. Is it too late to change your mind on Pgt testing? Do you mean after the embryos are frozen or in a fresh cycle? So if you're doing a fresh cycle, we really need to know at time of retrieval if you're considering Pgt testing. The latest that you could decide is day 3, because that's when we do the assisted hatching for the embryos for Pgt, but we can't start the Pgt process on day 3 because there's consent forms to be filled out, requisitions to be sent to Cooper. So we need to know on the day of your retrieval, preferably before. When getting 1 egg during retrieval, is it better to do a fresh transfer or a frozen? If you are planning on banking, that's totally fine. Our survival rate for freezing and thawing is 99%. So your embryos would be pretty safe. So if you were trying to get a few embryos in order to transfer them together, depending on your age and the quality of the embryos, you'd be fine to do some banking cycles. Rachel, I see that not at CNY. You said a courier lost your samples. I'm very sorry that happened to you. How risky would it be to biopsy again? So you're talking about rebiopsying embryos that were already biopsied. It's really going to depend on the grades of the embryos. It is a little bit stressful to put them through the process, but we do it every week and we do see success. So I would say it mostly depends on the grades of your embryos. If they're fair or good graded, they should be fine going through that process. But there is a risk sometimes, you know, if we thaw 5, maybe we can only biopsy 3 or 4. But we could talk through that together. Okay, so Victoria, you had a transfer on Saturday and your embryos are in the lab right now? Might be a little too late. I would call. I'm not sure what day your embryos are. If they're Blastocyst embryos, they may have been biopsied this morning. I'm just not sure where you're at in your cycle. Fresh versus frozen, what's best at age 43? Like I said before, the fresh versus frozen is pretty equivalent for us. I would have you talk to one of the doctors and they could give you a better answer about what might be best for your particular uterus. Should get there tomorrow. Okay. All right. I think that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the ICSI video. Thank you so much for asking all your questions. It really makes the time fly by for me, and I'm excited to get to interact with you guys a little bit since I'm always tucked away in the lab. I'm planning to do these videos monthly, usually the second Tuesday of every month. Last week I was off for a family emergency, but I will try to be consistent with the second Tuesday of every month. I'll try to get some of my friends in the lab to come on and talk to you too, once they see that it's not so bad. So yeah, I really appreciate you guys for watching. Thank you so much, and I will see you in March, okay? Feel free to keep posting questions. I will check back and look at them, and that'll help me figure out what else I need to talk about in the next live. All right. Thank you. Bye, guys.